Maybe you're a new player looking to dip your toes into Final Fantasy XIV for the first time, but you have no idea where to start. Maybe you've gotten a little experience, but you're looking to improve and deepen your understanding of the game so you can push towards tackling endgame. Heck, maybe you finish your leveling process and now you're looking to take the next step into Extreme, Savage and Ultimate. Maybe you already feel pretty secure in your knowledge base and you just want to hear the thoughts of somebody who's been playing the game at a high level across almost a decade now. There is something in this video for all of you. When I was planning my job guide resources for Dawntrail, I actually tried looking online to see if there was another video like this out there, like anywhere. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find one, so I decided to make one myself. The goal of this video is to teach you the basics, as well as some of the nuance of combat in FF14. It'll teach you to read and optimize your HUD, how to recognize mechanics in the various telegraphs that will be thrown at you, proper thought processes, and a hell of a lot more. There are chapters all the way through, so if you don't want to watch this all in one sitting, I totally understand, especially considering its runtime. Feel free to just skip to the parts that matter to you, and I appreciate you giving this absolute behemoth of a video a chance. Honestly, if you're a new player, I might even recommend that. There's a lot of information here and it's impossible that you'll be able to digest and immediately apply all of this at once, so make sure you pace yourself. Just so you know up front, I also have guides available that teach you the basics and nuance of each of the game's 3 roles: tank, healer and DPS. They'll be linked in the description when they release, so they're coming out in the next month or two. My recommendation is to watch this video and the video for the role you intend on playing, and if you decide you want to, a leveling guide for your job as well. It sounds like a lot, and yeah, honestly it kind of is, but that information should give you everything you need to excel all the way till endgame. I think if you're a new player, the easiest way to convey a lot of FF14's core concepts is just to bring up an encounter and look at it together. This is the first trial in the game, which you get at around level 20. There's a lot of lessons to take and implement even at this early point. Final Fantasy XIV's combat focuses around the Holy Trinity, with each job being either a tank, healer, or DPS in their role in the party. There's no swapping or customization, your job is that role, and there's no wiggle room. So for example, a paladin will always be a tank, and a ninja is and will always be a DPS. With those overarching categories, there are subcategories. Healers are made up of both pure and barrier healers, and DPS are split into melee DPS, physical range DPS, and magical range DPS. I won't go too deep into the strengths, weaknesses, and specialities of these roles, because if you want that information, you can hop into one of the role guides. But all you really need to know for now is that they exist, and they're important. FF14's content is split into a few different player size categories. Light party content, which mostly refers to dungeons and early game trials, is centered around a 4-player party, of which the standard composition is 1 tank, 1 healer and 2 DPS. This is what you'll get if you queue for it via Duty Finder. Full party content, which makes up a lot of the level 50 plus trials, as well as the game's endgame activities, double this, being comprised of 2 tanks, 2 healers and 4 DPS. You also get 24-player Alliance raids, of which we get 3 per expansion, which is formatted slightly differently. Instead having 3 full parties slotted together, with each party being built up from 1 tank, 2 healers and 5 DPS. If you want to easily discern what role a job is, just look at the colour. Blue is for tank, green is for healer, and red is for DPS. You receive bonus stats for being in a party with players of other roles. Within a party, players will receive a 1% stat bonus to their strength, vitality, dexterity, mind and intelligence, so every main stat for each unique role in their party up to a maximum of 5%. So 1% for having a tank, 1% for having a healer, 1 for a melee, 1 for a fizz ranged and 1 for a caster. This main stat buff is both very useful in terms of survivability and damage contribution. In endgame this is useful and you want to have 1 player of each role, but for early game it doesn't matter so much, so don't stress about it. At its core, your goal is to make the enemy's HP bar hit 0 before yours does. Pretty simple. Tanks hold aggro and take the brunt of the enemy's attacks, healers heal, and DPS have the primary responsibility of making that HP bar go lower as fast as possible. As a note, in Final Fantasy XIV, every single job and role is expected to do damage, and if you aren't at least trying to deal damage while playing, you're doing it wrong. This means that healers are healing and DPSing, tanks are tanking and DPSing. There is no I only heal, as that is unfortunately just another word for laziness. This game, much like World of Warcraft, has a global cooldown that makes up the core of its rotational loop for players in battle. Let's explain that real quick. When you press a button marked as a spell on Disciples of Magic, or as a weapon skill on Disciples of War, you're going to see it and all the other spells or weapon skills spin on your hotbar just like this. This is the global cooldown, or GCD. The base GCD time in FF14 is 2.5 seconds. Whilst your GCD is rolling, you cannot use another GCD until it's finished spinning. Anything marked as an ability does not cause your GCD to roll upon using it, meaning it is off the global cooldown and is referred to as an oGCD. As long as you aren't currently casting or animation locked, you can use an oGCD regardless of if your GCD is still rolling or not. This is called weaving. After using a spell or a weapon skill which is an instant cast, in most cases you can weave up to 2 oGCDs afterwards. So if you watch here, I'm doing my GCD, and then I press these 2 buttons, and they both go off before my GCD has finished spinning and is ready to go again, and I can continue to press the next one without any delay. There are a few exceptions, such as monks struggling a bit with weaving because of their speed of their attacks, or attacks like Primal Rend here having a long animation afterwards, but they'll be covered in job-specific guides in more detail. When it comes to casted spells, like say let's look at Stone as an example. So when you look at the tooltip, Stone is listed as having a 1.5 second base cast, but a 2.5 second recast. This means that the GCD is 2.5, but the cast itself is 1.5 seconds. This then means that after your cast is finished, you have a 1 second window in which you can use an oGCD, you can move, or anything else you like before you aim to press your next GCD. As a little note, your base cast and recasts are both affected by the spell speed stat, so that's why yours might look a little bit different to this. Similarly, for physical jobs, your skill speed affects the speed at which your GCD spins. So now, I'm going to teach you the number 1 lesson. That GCD, if there's something targetable that can be attacked, it should be rolling. There are very, very few exceptions to this. You've likely heard the term always be casting thrown around, and this is exactly what it's referring to. Learn your ABCs. Damage is king in this game, and you should make it your goal on all 3 rolls to play in such a way that you are always spinning your GCD and planning the next button you're going to press. To be completely frank, it's better to press the wrong button and have rolled your GCD and done something than it is to not press one at all. Pressing the right button in each circumstance will come with time and experience, but the one thing that is universal amongst bad players is the fact that they do not roll their GCD enough. You don't want to be that guy. If an enemy makes you pull away from your foe and you're a tank or melee DPS, move away and fill the downtime with your ranged attack, or once you're more confident, time your movement so that you can shift back in quickly to keep on hitting. You can even use your abilities to help facilitate this, such as gap closers. As a caster or healer, if an AOE puddle is dropped on you, use an instant or an ability like Swift Cast which provides you with one, or get ready to move quickly once your cast is over to avoid it in time. One thing I think is important to clarify here is I'm definitely not advocating for you to play greedy and get hit by stuff all the time. That's also bad. As a player, a lot of your journey towards improvement will be to find a balance between these 2 things. The pursuit of always hitting your GCD versus not getting hit in the process. I think this is important to learn early, because players that become the best are often those that test those upper limits of what's capable. There's a lot of room in FF14 to do some really cool stuff once you build up the experience. Err on the side of caution until you feel comfortable, and as your confidence level increases, you can push yourself harder and try more things. To give you an example, let's look at White Mage. Once you press one spell, you should immediately be hitting the key of the next spell to ensure that it casts instantly once your current one is over. Your goal is to have as much casting uptime as is possible based on the fight constraints. If you need to do healing GCDs, that's absolutely fine, they just replace a glare, and if you need to do instant off-global healing abilities such as Benediction or Tetragrammaton, you should aim to weave them without any clipping. Whitemage is fairly user-friendly with their base 1.5 second cast time on glare, giving you an ample opportunity to use those oGCD heals without pausing the attack. Let's say you get into a situation where you want to Asylum for the raid, Wings and Tetra the tank. You can do this across 3 GCDs, putting up Wings after 1 glare, then Asylum after a second, and finally using Tetra on the tank after the 3rd. Or alternatively, if your dot refresh is coming up, you could weave 2 immediately and then finally the 3rd after your next glare. You can also hold onto an Afflatus Misery or a Rapture for a little if you know that a double weave window is coming up in order to make sure the healing and mitigation comes out as rapidly as possible. Lastly, you could swift cast a glare to open up that double additional weave window should you need it. Always be thinking a little in advance about what weaves you need to do in the near future and when you need to do a few at a time, as well as the best order to actually use them in order to gain maximum value. FF14's combat is often referred to as taking the form of a dance. Each individual encounter has its own sequence of mechanics that are for the most part very scripted in terms of the order in which they appear, and your skill expression revolves around your ability to memorize, solve and perform these pre-planned dances correctly. This doesn't mean that FF14 combat is simple. As you get deeper into the game, individual mechanics become these sophisticated behemoths with numerous moving parts intersecting with one another, and doing it right can be both engaging and rewarding. This also doesn't mean that every attempt will be the exact same. There are small variations each pull, and certain fights have intentional RNG aspects to the order of certain things occurring, as well as which player will have to deal with each aspect of a party-wide mechanic. Basically, the overarching same thing happens each pull, for the most part, but your responsibilities within that pull can change on a run-by-run basis. I've not played World of Warcraft, but I've been told that much of the difficulty in raiding in that game relies on presenting players scenarios in which they must quickly react and juggle mechanics that have a lot of randomization and overlap. In Final Fantasy XIV, rather than being primarily reactive, most of the challenge is in proactively developing solutions to each battle, and then execute whichever responsibility within that solution you get laden with at the time. As a result, in being a good player in FF14, it's very important to plan ahead. Do I need to mitigate this upcoming damage? How am I going to avoid the AOE that I know is coming in 15 seconds? What do I need to do if I get X responsibility in that mechanic? Building your knowledge base is how you get better at this game, and the mentality I want you to take forward into every piece of content, be it dungeons, ultimate raids, or even MSQ duties, is this. It's okay to mess up and cause a reset, as long as you learn something from it. Think about what you did wrong, and what you can do next time to avoid it from happening, and then execute on your learnings. If you're unsure and it's group content you're in, ask questions and be receptive to advice. Every little piece of knowledge is a new trick that you can apply not only to this one challenge in front of you, but to many future ones in other paths as well. We're doing a lot of talk that may seem complicated, so let's go back and cover some of the basics. You see that ring on the floor surrounding the enemy, which changes colour from yellowish to red when they first attack you? That's the target ring. This is for all intents and purposes the hitbox and physical existence of the enemy in-game. As long as their target ring is touching something, they are inside it. And as long as you are inside their target circle, you're inside them. The little arrow sticking out the front shows you which way they're facing, and that little open space on the opposite side of the target ring shows you their back positional. Those little arrows on the left and right side are useful to help you easily see where they're facing, even if you're behind them, but they do not signify the flank positional. The side positional is actually like this. A full 90 degrees. So if you ever see in a tooltip that your skill is hit from the rear or hit from the flank, which is really only a thing on melee DPS in this game, you now know what those are. As a little note, there are some enemies in FF14 that have a full circular hitbox or are locked in place originating from the wall of the battle arena. These enemies do not have positionals at all, and you can completely ignore the positional requirements in those fights. Now let's take a look at this here. This is the party list, and you want to keep an eye on it at all times because it includes a bunch of information that's absolutely essential to the flow of combat. Going from left to right, you can see the job each player is on, their current HP, current MP, and the buffs or debuffs that are active on them at the moment. As a note, by default the buff bar only shows 5 rather than the full list to keep things clean, but you can customize that in the game settings. On top of the HP bar, you can see the value of any shields that you have, signified by that little yellow bar there tacked onto the white HP bar. So if I'm standing here with no shield, my HP bar looks like this. Then on Summoner I press Radiant Aegis, which is an ability that lets me put a shield on myself, and I get this little bonus to my overall bar here. You can also see the player name and level, and this little icon here shows whether their level is synced or not. Level sync is automatically applied when joining a duty where the character's level is higher than recommended. While the character's level is reduced, the character will temporarily lose access to any actions their job would normally learn above the synced level, with the exception of role actions. Their HP and the damage of their abilities will also be reduced, and the effective gear will be scaled down. Once the duty is finished or the player leaves, the character will afterwards be restored to their normal potential. Also, and more importantly, you can see a little number and bar on the bottom of the job icon for each player whenever you're targeting something. The bar is at various levels of full, and for one person it will say A, whereas for the others it will display a number between 1 and 7. This is how much enmity you have on the target, how close you are to being the focus of its ire and single target attacks. The A stands for aggro, as in currently has the full attention of the enemy and is likely being hit by it. The tank should in most cases have the A. If they don't, then that's probably an issue. On the right here is the duty information. This shows you the amount of time remaining before everybody is kicked from the instance and a failure state happens, as well as the name of the duty and what type of encounter it is, such as trial, dungeon, or high-end raid. You can also gain a little information on exactly what objectives you need to accomplish in order to achieve victory. Usually, it's literally as simple as get to the end of the dungeon or kill the boss, and there's not much else to pay attention to. This is the minimap. I don't have much more to say honestly, other than there is a minimap. It does exist. It can be useful for orienting yourself on an arena if you lose your way for a moment, but it isn't too core to the combat experience in particular moment to moment. I mentioned on the party list that you can see the buffs and debuffs of members of the party, including yourself, but that by default they are capped out at 5. Well, these things here, this is where the full list of your buffs and debuffs are listed, so that you can see the non-truncated version and get full understanding. I recommend you have these in a very visible place, like on my rather antiquated HUD, which I do believe still gets all the fundamentals correct. You can see that I have it just above my hotbars across the middle, planting it neatly in my peripheral vision, even while focusing on avoiding AOEs. Mine are split into enhancements or positive buffs, enfeeblements aka debuffs, and others, which separate out things like FC buffs to avoid them getting in the way. I'll be showing you how to mess around with your UI a little bit later, so don't worry too much about doing it yet. Below that you'll find my hotbars and job gauge. Every job has a gauge which is intrinsic to playing them correctly, albeit some more so than others. This big bar in the middle is extremely important. This is your target bar. It shows the HP of whatever you're targeting right now, as well as any debuffs or buffs they currently have on them. This is intrinsic to the combat experience and you want to have it front and center, because often as a part of your damaging rotation you'll be applying debuffs to enemies that need to be refreshed, or under the mechanical constraints of an encounter you'll need to track timers or buffs on the boss themselves. You see this little circle and the 3 arrows on the bottom right of the target bar? When this is there, that means you are currently auto-attacking the enemy. When it's not there, you are not. Generally, if you can, you want to be auto-attacking, especially on physical jobs because it's very free, useful damage that matters a lot more than you think. There's more on that in the job guides. You can also see who is being currently targeted, aka the player that has aggro of your target. This is the target of target. Right here, we can see the enemy list. This is where the magic happens. Here you can see a list of all of the enemies that are currently in combat with you, as in you've been hit by them once, or they've hit you once, or aggro in some way, shape or form has been generated on them. You can also see a second indicator of how much aggro you have relative to other players on each mob. Green means you're nowhere close to having aggro, yellow means you are third on the aggro list for that enemy, orange means that you're second, and red means you are currently number 1 on the target's enmity and then have aggro. You can see a smaller version of their HP bar to track how low or high they are, their name, and most importantly of all, you can see their cast bars here very clearly. There's also little letters next to each enemy, like Omega Y, which while being an unintended source of hilarity, also exists to help you differentiate when you're pulling multiple of the same type of mob at once, and assist in players coordinating which one to attack if one in particular needs to be focused or interrupted. Honestly though, this doesn't get used a crazy amount. You can also see enemy cast bars on the target list like I mentioned. This is one of the most powerful tools you can possess as an FF14 player, because as long as you can recognize what each cast means through practice and memory, you will always know what's coming next. If we use Titan Hard as an example because it's a very early game and fairly spoiler-free fight, he'll cast Landslide, which is where he'll turn towards a random player and aimless line attack towards them. If you get hit by this, you'll be knocked off the edge of the arena and instantly die. But you know exactly how much time you have to avoid it, because when the animation appears, Titan begins a cast bar to execute the attack. When he jumps away from the arena, you instantly know that something is going to happen because you can see via the enemy list that he's casting Geocrush, even if he isn't currently targetable. Keep this list in your field of view at all times and refer to it constantly, and it will save you more times than you'll possibly be able to count. This is the focus target bar. You don't naturally have a focus target, but I recommend that you do focus target and do so liberally. I pretty much always have something focus targeted when I'm in combat, and I think it's a smart thing to do in general. To focus target on controller, and yeah, I'm listing controller first because I'm a controller player and I'm gonna have to look up how to do it on keyboard and mouse. You hit square at the thing you want to focus target, which will open the subcommand menu, and then hit X on the focus target option. On keyboard and mouse, you can right click to open the subcommand menu and then click on focus target, and you can also set up a lot of hotkeys to make it faster if you wish. Focus target allows you to bring an enemy or ally and give them a nice individualized little section of your HUD so you can always see exactly what they're doing. You can see HP, cast bars, as well as buffs or debuffs. In terms of how you use this, my personal recommendation is that you default to focus targeting a boss you're fighting, and if you're currently battling against 2 targets at once, I like to focus target the one I'm not currently attacking, so I can still easily track them both at once. It's also an occasional viable option to focus target a member of the party that has a mechanic that interacts with your own personal responsibilities. So if you find it useful to have a deep dive on that player or to remember that this is the person I need to do that mechanic with later, it's a good shout as well. Lastly, for healers and casters and special boys like Samurai, you have your cast bar. This shows the progress of whatever cast you're currently executing, and because moving while casting causes it to cancel, you want to make sure it's visible to avoid that from happening, ever if possible. This up here is your limit break gauge. Limit break is a special attack that is shared between your entire party and generates over time and when a few certain parameters are met. You don't need to worry much about building it for now, that'll happen naturally, but because it's shared among the party, you should worry about when you'll be using it and who will be pressing the button. Limit break has 3 bars, the third only being available in full party content, and each roll's LB has a different effect. Tanks provide a group-wide damage mitigation, with the strength scaling based on the level of the LB. Healers will heal the party, and for the most part their limit breaks 1 and 2 are very lackluster, but their LB3 will resurrect all dead players without the weakness debuff they usually obtain from being raised, which is really strong. Melee DPS will do a super strong single target attack, and ranged and casters will both do a strong AOE attack with different telegraphs. In dungeons, DPS will generally be using the LBs, a caster or ranged LB on a large trash pack is the best thing you can possibly do, followed by a melee LB on the boss as a secondary measure. In trials and raids it depends, sometimes you need the LB for a tank or healer to survive the mechanic. Otherwise, it depends on the constraints of the fight and you'll want to use discretion. For example, sometimes there are intermission raid wides that are completely unsurvivable without a tank LB3. Sometimes you need to heal your LB to cleanse a debuff, or specifically the caster should use their LB for some reason or another. You can consider the melee LB to be the default here though. Now that you know how to read what you're seeing on screen during a battle, I'm going to go through a bunch of basic concepts and explain them to you, followed by doing a slightly deeper dive on a few that are a bit more involved. After that, there will be a nice big section showing you my recommendations for optimizing your HUD, as well as a huge dictionary on regularly occurring mechanics and how to recognize and complete them. Lastly, I've put together a big list of FF14 terminology that I think will be helpful for new and experienced players alike, because I know it can be a little daunting to try and understand what on earth people are saying in party chat half the time. This is an AOE, or area of effect. You can think of it simply as this is the bad and I do not want to stand in it. AOEs can take all different shapes and sizes, and much of the combat flow in 14 revolves around your enemies conjuring AOEs in various shapes, cadences and patterns, sometimes making an intricate mess of the floor in the arena, and you as a player needing to dodge them all while still doing damage, because, as we mentioned before, you need to make him die before you die. Speaking of arenas, these are the spaces in which your battles take place, and I have a poignant tip for you. More often than not, this equals bad. Sometimes you can walk straight off the edge of the arena, and that's bad. Sometimes, if you stand at the edge of the arena, your HP ends up in a less than ideal situation very quickly as well, and that's also bad. Sometimes it's fine, but if you don't know for sure, it's better not to risk it. If you open your menu here, this is your item level. This is the average level of all of your equipped pieces of gear, automatically calculated by the system to give you one singular number. In order to get into a lot of the game's content, you need to have a minimum valid item level to get in. So if we skim over a couple of duties here, you can see it says recommended minimum item level. If your gear is below that minimum item level, you can't do the duty. Gear will determine the majority of your defensive and offensive stats. You get gear naturally through doing your MSQ, so you shouldn't have to worry too much about this whilst leveling your first job. But for alternate jobs, you might end up purchasing gear, so I wanted to include this little note as well. If you end up buying gear off the market board, ever, you want to check for this little symbol right here. This means that piece of equipment is considered high quality. High quality gear is very important to the extent that non-HQ gear is mostly considered worthless for actual use and is only acceptable if you're using it as an appearance-only glamour item. HQ pieces of gear have majorly boosted stats over non-HQ pieces. You'll also need to repair your gear at numerous points throughout your journey. This bar here in the character screen next to each piece of gear shows its durability. If it hits 0, you'll lose the bonus stats from the gear until it's repaired. You can repair it at various NPCs that are available in basically every major city-state or location, as well as placed in your personal or free company houses, but you can also repair them yourself. To repair your own gear, you must have a high enough repair level, which is 10 levels lower than the equip level for the gear and materials known as dark matter. Dark matter comes in various grades, and the item help window for each piece of equipment shows the grade of dark matter required to repair it. Provided you have the requisite dark matter in your inventory, you can repair your own gear in practically any location. While menders can restore your gear to 100% durability, repairing it yourself allows you to exceed this and have the item last even longer than usual. For example, repairing an item that is at 99% durability will increase it to 199%. You can also ask other players in duty to help you repair. Don't neglect your gear. I'll also quickly cover the two main types of consumables that you'll be using regularly in combat: food and potions. Food can be used for two purposes. Firstly, for a 3% boost to XP obtained, and secondly, for a small but definitely not insignificant stat boost. I honestly recommend you hold on to a stack of super cheap food like mineral water at all times and keep it active whenever you're not max level on the job you're playing. They're so cheap and accessible that you might as well just take the free 3% gain. At endgame, you primarily use it for the stat boost, because each food contains a boost to your HP from vitality as well as a myriad of damage buffs. It's an expectation in Savage and Ultimate content that you bring relevant food and use it whilst raiding, even in Party Finder or pickup group scenarios, and honestly, I would recommend it for slightly more casual content like Extreme Trials as well. Potions or tinctures can be used to give you a shot of a significant stat boost for a short period of time. Potions have a cooldown for their usage, so you can't constantly spam them. Once again, you'll be bringing these primarily in Savage and Ultimate content, but because during the MSQ you'll receive a decent number of free potions as rewards, and these potion levels will be too low item level to be worth using in that endgame content, I recommend holding onto them so that you can burn these while you're practicing. Additionally, ethers can be pretty useful for healers, and slightly less so but still kind of worthwhile on casters occasionally, as an alternative due to their ability to replenish your mana. These can be absolutely invaluable during a progression or recovery setting, and you should consider keeping a stash for that reason. With every major content update, new food and potions become available, and it's generally expected at endgame that you make the best available food and pots and use them. They can be crafted or purchased from the market board. Next, I'll quickly run you through the stats in Final Fantasy XIV, what they mean and why they matter before we go into the meat of the combat flow nuance. There are attributes which are more commonly referred to as main stats and meldable substats. By meldable, I mean that substats can be augmented by materia slots on your gear, which will absolutely become a factor as you hit endgame and start doing raiding content. You'll get comfortable with melding your gear there, and there will be tons of guides available that can help you meld your gear in the best way possible once you reach that point. Until then, you can kind of ignore melding as a concept for the most part. Strength affects physical damage dealt by most tank and physical melee jobs, as well as the auto attacks of a few outliers. Dexterity affects physical range damage and damage dealt by rogue and ninja attacks. Vitality affects your maximum HP. Intelligence affects attack magic potency when the roll is magical DPS. Mind affects healing magic potency. It also affects attack magic potency if you're playing a healer. Critical hit affects the amount of physical and magical damage dealt, as well as HP restored. The higher the value, the higher the frequency with which your hits will be critical, and the higher the potency of those critical hits. Heals can crit as well. Because critical hit acts to boost both the frequency and power of crits, it is widely considered the most important secondary attribute for increasing DPS, and as such is often prioritized for melding. Determination affects the amount of physical damage dealt by both physical and magical attacks, as well as the amount of HP restored by healing spells. Determination is somewhat more consistent, as its effect is always active, and is slightly more flexible than direct hit rate, as Determination also improves healing. But due to scaling slightly differently, which of direct hit or determination are considered stronger for a gear set can often go either way. While the in-game tooltip specifies that determination only affects healing GCDs, it also boosts the healing from oGCDs as well. Direct hit rate affects the rate at which your physical and magical attacks land direct hits, dealing 25% more damage than normal hits. The higher the value, the higher the frequency with which your hits will be direct. You can tell a direct hit by the exclamation mark that pops up alongside its hit text when you use it. Heals cannot direct hit. You can see a comparison between a direct hit and a direct critical hit here. Skill speed affects both the cast and recast timers, as well as the damage over time potency for weapon skills and auto attacks. The higher the value, the shorter the timers, and the higher the potency. Spell speed affects both the casting and recast timers for spells, and specifically only attacks marked as spells. The higher the value, the shorter the timers. It also affects the spell's damage over time or healing over time potency. Tenacity affects the amount of damage dealt and received, as well as HP restored. The higher the value, the more damage dealt, the more HP restored, and the less damage taken. This sounds really good in theory for tanks, but in practice it's very underwhelming and is considered a mostly unwanted stat due to the small impact per point that tenacity provides compared to the relative impact of something like critical hits. Piety affects MP regeneration during combat. Regeneration rate is determined by the amount of piety you have. Due to the wealth of MP management actions that high-level healers have, piety is generally minimized when possible in favor of DPS increasing substats such as crit. However, some amount of piety is helpful when in a progression scenario. You also have properties like attack power, which only comes on weapons and is stronger overall than any kind of stat listed below it. Attack power in most cases wins over everything else. Gear also innately has defense and magic defense stats linked to their equipment item level. Whilst in combat in Final Fantasy XIV, the order in which you press your skills is called your rotation. Most jobs either have a very strict static rotation that loops every 60 to 120 seconds, or a slightly more RNG priority system. Priority systems usually refer to jobs that receive percentage chance procs to unlock new skills, and the management of not overcapping those skills and using them correctly making up the core of the difficulty curve. Jobs like Bard and Dancer can be considered prime examples of this. Your rotation often starts off very simple, and as you level you gain more and more skills which will slot into your rotation. Your goal is to do your rotation as best you can to deal as much damage as possible while safely completing the mechanics of the encounter and avoiding unnecessary damage. I'll have leveling guides available for every job in the coming months that will not only give you all the information on what each skill does as you unlock it, it also helps you slot together and practice a functional rotation at every level range so you can develop good habits early. You'll also see openers referenced frequently, because most of your strongest skills have cooldowns and can't be regularly pressed. FF14 damage profiles look a little like this: big spikes at the start and every 2 minutes, with smaller ones at intervals in between. These big spikes are when your raid buffs and big hits become available and are used. Your opener is here, the point at the start of an encounter where you have access to everything, and you want to spend it as quickly and efficiently as possible to deal as much damage as possible. When all your resources become available again, and you're ready to do a big burst of damage, which is usually every 2 minutes, it is often referred to as either your 2-minute window, or your re-opener, or even your burst window. There's usually 1 or 2 binary best openers for each job, and it's a good idea to put in the effort to learn them when you hit max level. Once again, those are covered in those job guides I talked about a little bit ago. I imagine you're thinking that it sounds pretty challenging to do your rotation, whilst needing to constantly move around, occasionally needing to peel away to stay safe. Well, it is, and that's also part of the reward of mastering the game. The amount of time you spend hitting the enemy without pause, or as a caster or healer the amount of time you spend slinging your damage spells, is called your uptime. Your goal is always to A. not get hit by unnecessary damage and successfully complete mechanics, and B. to keep as much uptime as possible, in that order. What makes this so interesting, and often what keeps players engaged well beyond completing content for the first time, is that keeping uptime offers a completely different challenge in individual mechanics on individual jobs. You can expend your resources to do something like a swift cast to move, or toe the line by shifting out of the AOE with tighter timing to ensure you don't have to peel away and be rendered unable to attack. Just remember to play safe, and only take risks when you feel the confidence to do so. It makes sense to do so here, I think, so I'm going to teach you about 2 key tools you will use in order to maintain uptime across the majority of the game's combat. As a tank or melee DPS, you do not need to be all the way right up against the hitbox in order to use your skills, because weapon skills in FF14 actually have a maximum viable range of 3 yalms. If you want to see exactly how much distance that is in game, what I'm showing you right here is max melee range. You can tell when you stray outside of melee range very easily. As soon as you do, you'll see that little red X appear, signifying that you're no longer able to use weapon skills anymore. You'll naturally gain a better understanding innately of where max melee range is by playing more, and you can use this to dodge a lot of enemy attacks without needing to do anything too special at all. Try and practice getting a feel for where max melee range is on striking dummies so that when a scenario appears in which you need to utilize it, you can, quickly. You can also quickly dip in and out of melee range before your GCD finishes rolling, allowing you to quickly react to incoming AOEs if you do it well, often only costing you an auto attack rather than a full-on GCD. For those players with cast bars, you're going to want to learn, and learn quickly at that, how to slide cast. If you watch here, you'll see that near the end of each full cast, where there's around 0.75 to 0.5 of a second left of the cast, I'm moving a little bit and then stopping as the cast completes, but my cast is not cancelled by the movement I just made. That's slide casting and is basically you abusing the game's engine to make small movements during the cast themselves. So much of FF14's mechanics revolve around positioning yourself in a certain spot at a certain time, and when you don't have complete freedom of movement, you want to make the most of any window of opportunity possible to get there quickly. This means taking advantage of both instant and slide casts to get yourself from spot to spot without losing uptime. I'd advise practicing this whenever you can, in roulettes, on a dummy, whatever, and get as consistent at it as you can because it will help you an absolute ton. If you want a simple little tip to help you understand when your slide casting window opens more easily, I find this one to be very handy in teaching new players. If you take an emote and place it somewhere visible on your hotbar and just keep an eye on it while you're casting, you're going to notice that it greys out during the cast and then lights up again slightly before the cast ends. When it lights back up, you can slide cast. This emote on your hotbar is the perfect set of slide casting training wheels. Use this as a reference point while practicing, and eventually, with comfort and time, you'll get a feeling for just how early you can slide cast and you won't need to refer to it at all. Let's cover the failure state for not keeping uptime. Of course, at a macro level, spending extended periods of time just not pressing anything is something to avoid. But at this point, I think I've spent enough time drilling it into you to just press anything rather than letting that happen. The other less noticeable issue that can arise fairly easily and cost you uptime a lot is through clipping your GCD. In essence, every time you weave incorrectly or slide cast for too long or anything like that, your GCD will stop rolling momentarily, and this is referred to as clipping your GCD. This is to be avoided if possible because whilst each instance is fairly small, it adds up fast and reduces the amount of overall time that you end up pressing actions, because every action, even off global instance, have an innate animation delay. Like I mentioned earlier, after an instant you can usually weave 2 oGCDs, except on a couple particular jobs and skill speeds, and after a half cast you can weave 1. These are rules to take and apply as consistently as you can. Let's go back to White Mage because it's an example we've used before quite a lot. I'm using Glare, and then I use Assay's followed by Tetra before my next Glare. You'll see here that I clipped the GCD because I did that. It stops rolling for a moment before the next Glare. This is because Glare is a half cast, affording me 1 weave opportunity afterwards. Then I use Assay's, which has its own animation lock accompanying it, preventing me from using another skill for a short amount of time, literally around 0.6 or 0.7 of a second. And then I use Tetra, which has its own animation lock too, and by that point, partway through the Tetragrammaton delay, my GCD completes its full turn and is ready to spin again. But I can't. You'll get used to avoiding unnecessary clipping fairly quickly, so at this point it's just something to bear in mind, and if you correctly implement what you've learned so far, you shouldn't see it happen too often. You can tell if a debuff on yourself or another party member can be cleansed with a Suna by looking at it. If it has that little bar on top, it can be cleansed. If it doesn't, it cannot. Pay special attention to the Doom debuff. Here's what it looks like. This will usually kill a player if it hits 0, so cleanse this as a matter of priority. Only healers and bard are capable of cleansing, so ensure to coordinate with your party to make sure you're cleansing anything potentially lethal. Some enemy cast bars or abilities can be interrupted, halting their progress and avoiding what can often be a headache to deal with. To add to this, occasionally in raids there are enemy casts that need to be interrupted to avoid a wipe state, so it's worth paying attention to. You can tell if an attack can be interrupted by the pulsing animation you see here being shown as the cast bar progresses. Both Interject, a tank roll action, and Head Graze, a physical range DPS roll action, can be used to achieve this effect. I'm also going to list a couple of other status afflictions that players can affect enemies with. Bear in mind that these are a lot more limited and situational in their uses. Many foes are immune to most or all of these statuses, but you can likely find value from them in the overworld, in dungeons, and in deep dungeons such as Palace of the Dead. Low Blow from tanks and Leg Sweep from physical melee DPS, both of which are roll actions, can be used to stun an enemy for a few seconds. Arm's Length, which can be used by tanks and melee DPS once more, is the most useful of these skills, applying a slow to the enemies that hit you while it's active. This slow makes them attack less regularly until the debuff drops off. This acts as a mitigative defensive cooldown in dungeons as it works on the majority of trash mobs. Leg Graze, available for range DPS, can heavy a target, slowing their movement speed for a period of time. Foot Graze, again available to physical range DPS via their roll actions, can bind a target, which completely renders them unable to move for a few seconds. Lastly, Sleep and Repose, which belong to healers and casters as the namesake would imply, can put an enemy to sleep, allowing you to break aggro and continue your journey unhindered. Many aspects of FF14, including both healing over time and damage over time effects, work based off the game's innate server ticks. The server tick occurs every 3 seconds. You can use this as an indicator to calculate the total potency of damage or healing over time actions. Let's look at Arrow, the first iteration of your damage over time spell as a White Mage or Conjurer. It has an initial potency of 50 and deals 30 additional potency per tick for 30 seconds. Because the dot will tick every 3 seconds, this means that your arrow, if applied and left to tick for its full duration, will deal 350 potency of damage, which is over double that of a stone, the filler spell available at a similar level. Heal over times, even ground effects like Asylum, as well as the passive HP and MP regeneration of the player, are all subject to the server tick. Mitigation is an important part of playing every role in the game, and you've heard me refer to it a few times already, so I feel like an explanation is in order. Mitigation refers to defensive skills that are used to reduce incoming damage on the party or player. It can refer to tanks using their cooldowns to protect themselves, or to players using their group defensives to protect the entire raid before a big hit. Mitigation is the responsibility of the entire party, and everybody has at least 1 or 2 abilities to offer that can help with this. There's a term that gets thrown around that you might hear occasionally, which is EHP, or effective health points. This factors in your current HP, shields, as well as damage reduction buffs and debuffs on the enemy. Your goal, as a party, is to provide enough of all of these things to survive the next incoming attack, and at the same time to not go completely crazy and use everything all at once on this one instance of damage, leaving nothing for what's yet to come in the next 1, 2, or more instances of the encounter. In lower end content, this doesn't matter too much and isn't punishing at all, but the higher you go, this will become something you want to consider and attempt to plan for. Damage in this game often follows fairly scripted cadences, so once you're more experienced you'll be able to get a feel for it pretty easily, and encounter guides will often provide direction on which parts are a good target for certain mitigations. One very essential note is that damage reduction works multiplicatively, not additively, so a 10% mitigation would reduce an incoming hit of 100 to 90, but if you stack 2 10% mitigations, it'll reduce the incoming damage to 81 rather than to 80. Finally, if you stack a third 10% mitigation, it'll reduce that damage to 72.9 instead of 70. Essentially, stacking mitigation can be very strong, but there is a small level of diminishing returns there that can often punish you for investing too many resources all at once. Plan out your mitigation as a party and collectively adjust and shift things that aren't working in order to deal with the encounter you're facing. Also, one more thing to bear in mind is that you cannot stack multiples of the same mitigation. For example, both tanks have access to Reprisal because it's a roll action skill, but that does not mean that you can just use 2 reprisals on an instance of oncoming damage. They will instead overlap one another, and the most recently used one is the one that will have an effect. There are 3 main types of incoming damage in this game: physical, magical, and unique, which is traditionally referred to as darkness damage. Honestly, you'll probably hear me refer to it as darkness damage too, because that's what I know it as. Physical and magical are 2 sides of the same coin. They are the normal damage types in FF14. The main differential between these two are that different jobs and characters have varied physical and magical defense, meaning they will take slightly more or less to one type of these attacks, and that some mitigation abilities will say reduce 10% of physical damage but only 5% of magical damage, or vice versa, in this case Feint and Adder. Interestingly, you can block both physical and magical damage, but you can only parry physical damage. Darkness damage works very differently though. It cannot be mitigated by actions that affect only physical or magical damage, although some sources of darkness damage can be mitigated by abilities that reduce all damage taken. Examples of a few effective abilities are Reprisal, Sacred Soil, Carachol, and Passage of Arms. Often tank invulns are also not effective against it. You can tell what type of damage an attack is, either incoming or outgoing, by paying attention to the floating battle text. Physical damage is signified by a little sword icon, magical by the purple staff, and unique by the green star. There are technically more types of damage, but for all intents and purposes of reducing your incoming damage, these are the 3 that matter. There are also duty-specific types of damage, such as fire elemental attacks in an encounter which can apply a fire resist down debuff to players, and solving some kind of mechanic can cleanse it, or that attack must be avoided at all costs. Elemental damage itself, aside from this, is a bit of an antiquated mechanic that doesn't really matter anymore though. On top of this, there is what is often referred to as percentage damage. This is damage that deals a percentage of your maximum HP and damage, rendering all mitigation aside from pure shielding worthless. For example, Eden's Prime's dimensional shift here deals percentage damage, meaning that in these clips, you'll see that I take the exact same amount of damage with and without debuffing the boss attacks, but in this third case, where I use a shield on myself, I take less, because it eats through the shield first. Not all mechanics are built equal in this game. Instead, different mechanics can complete based on different cues, rather than there being a one-size-fits-all that can be applied to every situation. The moment that a mechanic completes, and player positions as well as their success or failure state is locked in and checked server-side, is called the snapshot of that mechanic. If you are safe from the mechanic at the moment that it snapshots, you are safe from the mechanic full stop, and can proceed to move freely. This means that depending on how the mechanic snapshots, you can do some fairly ludicrous things to take advantage of them. I'm going to run down some of the main types of snapshot, as well as refer to some examples so you can get a good idea of what's capable, but just as a quick reiteration, you can't really know the snapshot of the mechanic without testing it for yourself or getting that information from somebody else who already knows. There is no in-game indicator to tell you what's what. Some abilities snapshot at the end of their cast bar. This is on the whole the most common kind of snapshot in the game, and it's a safe first assumption to make. In the examples I'm showing here, you'll see that I'm dodging out of the stack before the animation goes off, and it looks like I miss it completely, but because it goes off at the end of the cast bar, I share the damage and successfully complete the mechanic. This is also an important lesson that cast bars and animations for attacks are not completely synced up. Similarly, here it looks like I'm standing in the danger zone as the animation resolves, but because I dodged out of it as the cast bar ended, then back in immediately afterwards, I am considered to be safe by the server and have dodged the AOE. It doesn't matter where I am, it matters where the server believes me to be when the snapshot goes off. Other abilities snapshot when the animation completes, completely ignoring their cast bar. Alexander turn 12 right here is a very classic example to use. This is Sacrament. and as the Sacrament cast bar ends, the mechanic doesn't actually snapshot. Instead, as the beams go off, animation-wise, that's when you need to avoid, meaning you can stay inside hitting the boss, maintaining an extra few precious seconds of uptime before evading the attack right before the beams shoot. Thirdly, there are what I call Feelycraft snapshots. These mechanics do not quite snapshot on cast bar, nor on animation, but somewhere in between. For example, they might snapshot their damage or AOE partway through the cast bar's completion rather than at the end, or even after the cast bar is over, but a second before the animation goes off. These are not super common, but they definitely do occur, and they're the trickiest to deal with because you need to learn the individual snapshot of that one mechanic, and sometimes the only way to do that is via trial and error. Until you're super comfortable, give these mechanics a wide berth and play them very safely. Player abilities are also subject to the whims of snapshotting. For example, if you as a tank press your rampart for a 20% mitigation, halfway through the Tank Buster cast bar, you will receive the 20% reduction in the damage from the hit. However, if you press it during those precious few moments between the cast bar ending and the animation going off, you'll take the full damage, your rampart being rendered useless. The same is true of player damage buffs. Let's say on Warrior, you need to keep up your Surging Tempest buff. It's about to drop, but you hit your skill just a split second before it does so. Even if the damage registers after the buff has dropped, because you pressed the button before it dropped, it will go off with the 10% damage applied. This is because instant skills in Final Fantasy XIV snapshot on button press, and for the record, Positionals do this too. Casted spells, however, snapshot at the end of the cast bar. One reason this is especially relevant, even in lower stakes encounters, is because snapshotting is very important for aggro manipulation in the form of tank swapping. You'll need to tank swap quite a lot in 8-man content in this game, and for the majority of casted tank busters, the target is locked in and selected at the start of the cast rather than at the end. This means that if you're the secondary tank who needs to provoke, in almost every case you are safely able to do this during the cast bar of the tank buster. The other tank will take the hit, and then the boss will swap its focus to you afterwards, giving you more of a buffer window to fulfill your responsibilities with less timing intensity. One thing that is not snapshotted is your HP. If the cast bar for a raid-wide ends, and the player is not fully topped, but their HP is recovered in those moments before the raid damage applies, it will factor in the damage including your freshly recovered HP, allowing the opportunity for players to make some smart snap decision making and save themselves or party members with HP recovery tools. Now, this section is going to be a bit of a big one. I'm going to run down as many common terms and telegraphs or indicators in the game as I can think of off the top of my head, and explain to you what they are and how to understand or deal with them. I'm sure I'm going to miss a few, and I apologise for that, but the game is so exceptionally dense that that's always going to happen. This should give you an understanding of all of the common and most important ones, and also help you navigate the confusing player language that can definitely be present. We'll start with telegraphs and indicators. Please note that these aren't completely universal. Final Fantasy XIV is a game that's been around for a long time and has undergone a lot of changes in terms of quality of life during that time, and the standardization of telegraphs has been a much more recent occurrence. So I guess what I can say is you can use these as a reference most of the time, but there will always be an exception or two present at some point in the game. Firstly, there are standard area of effect attacks. These either go off at the end of the cast bar or after a few seconds, and they come in all shapes and sizes. There are circle AOEs, cone AOEs, donut AOEs, and line AOEs, and everything in between. Bear in mind that not all AOEs within a category are the same. They can be different sizes or resolve at different speeds, and it's down to you to pay attention to the individual fight to figure out exactly which one is in play at the moment. Also, they aren't all necessarily orange and pulsing like this either. For example, look at this AOE from the Sunken Temple of Khan. The Ankh adds that spawn will shoot line AOEs at the player, but instead of them being orange in colour, they're a blue. Nothing really changes for all intents and purposes, just avoid them, but I thought it was worth mentioning. This is a gaze attack, signified by the glowing eye indicator. It applies a negative effect to you if you're looking at the enemy when the mechanic snapshots. To avoid it, simply look away as it goes off and continue doing what you're doing. Of note, usually enemies have these gaze attacks, but sometimes encounters contain mechanics where a gaze debuff is applied to an ally, making them the target you need to avoid locking eyes with when the debuff hits 0. This is a stack marker. Stack markers deal high damage to the target within them, which can be split by having other players standing it alongside them. The key is in the name. To solve it, players need to stack together and split the damage. With these normal kinds of stacks, ideally you have every player inside, but sometimes you can get multiple stack markers at once, requiring the raid to split into 2 parties of 4. There are different types of stacks too, for example this line-shaped stack marker, which splits damage between all of the party members who are in a roughly straight line in front of or behind the target. There's also this gaze stack, which splits damage of those inside, but the players inside must look away from the target when the mechanic resolves. There's also this spooky red stack here. This is a shared tank buster, rather than a full group stack. You see the 2 red orbs in the middle? It signifies that 2 targets should be sharing the damage, so the tanks should share this hit, with the rest of the party avoiding it. I mentioned a 2 tank buster share just now, so let's look at tank buster indicators real quick. Some busters have no indicators, but this one for example shows that the target is about to take a heavy hit intended for tanks. This one however will do the same but in a line AoE. There are cleave busters too. This tether signifies a buster as well, in that it will hit the main tank and the target tethered by it as well, and you usually want that person to be the second tank. Usually it hits the person closest to that tank, so the second tank wants to come close to make sure they're taking that bonus or shared hit. This is a flare. Flares deal significant damage to the player marked with them, and distance-based proximity damage to other players. In order to deal with these correctly, the marked player should move away from the rest of the raid, and other players should give them a wide berth. This is a tower. When this mechanic resolves, you need to have a player inside it, or it will explode and kill either players, deal damage, or apply a dangerous debuff as a failure state. Towers come in all shapes and sizes, such as this tower which requires multiple players inside to correctly solve, visualized by the multiple spires within it and the notches that light up when you enter it. These too are types of towers, even though they look a little different. While you're inside the tower, it has the added quirk of slowly dealing damage over time to the player, incentivizing them to shuffle in closer to the snapshot rather than immediately stepping in. Sometimes it's good to stand inside the AOEs essentially. This is a proximity impact. It deals damage relative to your distance from the origin point. Sometimes this mechanic also has a knockback component attached to it too. To safely complete these telegraphs, you simply need to put enough distance between you and it in order to reduce the incoming damage to easily survivable levels. This is a knockback indicator. There are a lot of variable and inconsistent knockback tells and animations, but the most common one is this pulsing blue circle. You'll want to position yourself on the outside of the circle in the direction where you have plenty of room to be pushed away safely. If you're standing inside the circle, you'll take heavy damage and probably die. You can usually use knockback immunity skills like arm's length and surecast to negate this, but there are instances of knockbacks that cannot be negated, so please bear in mind that this can happen. This is a target marker, this is a target marker. These are target markers. They're all target markers. These all technically mean slightly different things, but they are all within the same umbrella. If you get a marker on your head, something is about to happen to you and you specifically in a few moments. Some of them are as simple as letting you know that an AOE puddle is about to drop on you. Some will drop a proximity marker on you that you must place away from your allies. Others drop an expanding AOE. Basically, you'll learn and experience each of these over time in different encounters and learn what each one does within that scenario over time. Just bear in mind for now, the marker on head means you are going to have to deal with something in the imminent future. These are add summon markers. Basically, after a period of time, usually linked to the completion of a cast but not always, these circles on the ground will summon adds. This is a bad thing and should be avoided. To prevent the adds from spawning, ensure that the telegraphed number of players stand together within the circle to deactivate it. There are alternate versions of these that might require players to specifically be inside them at the end of the cast too, so your mileage may vary based on fight. Usually when these mechanics occur, you as a player will need to be involved in deactivating multiple plates rather than just one as a heads up. This right here, this shows that the arena is about to change size or shape. It's shrinking. Don't stand in the part that's inside the AOE, because if you do, a few seconds later you'll be standing on nothing at all. This happens in a few fights in Final Fantasy XIV, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because of the telegraphed afterwards. When the floor becomes ice, for any reason, it's usually a good idea to stop moving, or you'll slip and slide across the floor. This could result in you falling off of the arena, or ending up in a disadvantageous position. What you'll see more often than the ice floor, however, are fire and ice debuffs assigned to the player, generally called pyretic and freeze or deep freeze. When it comes to pyretic, when the debuff is active you will take a large amount of damage every time you move or execute an action, so you should avoid doing so. For freeze, when it snapshots if you are not moving you will turn into a block of ice, unable to do anything for a little while. And what have I been teaching you this whole time? Not doing stuff bad. So when you see pyretic on yourself, stop moving right before it reaches 0 and becomes active, and once it drops off you're free to move as you like. For freeze, just make sure you're moving during the snapshot and you should be good. This guy right here is a dive bomb. When this mechanic snapshots, the location where the marked player was will shortly be dived, usually by an enemy outside of the arena perimeter by a large invisible line AOE. If hit, you'll likely either get insta-killed or knocked back, or both. Some dive bombs snapshots their trajectory the moment the AOE appears, but most will do so the moment the marker disappears. You usually want to aim these in such a way that the dive won't dash through spots you want to leave open, nor through other players, and then avoid, but the specifics will depend on the encounter in question. These are usually referred to as Shiva circles. This mechanic places several AOEs around the arena, usually in a circular shaped pattern with an additional one in the centre. They will spawn one by one and explode in the same order they originally spawned in. To avoid it, stand in one of the last AOEs to drop, then dodge into the first one after it goes off. This is a tether. Tethers can be used to telegraph a number of different things, but it's usually clear which one you're dealing with by the appearance of the tether itself. There are standard orange tethers, which are generally just a marking for an upcoming mechanic. Importantly, tethers can usually, but not always, be traded to another player by running through them, causing the tether to snap onto the new target. This purple tether is usually a tell that something that shouldn't happen is occurring. For example, a boss might spawn a purple tether to an ad, and then the boss will not take any damage until the ad has been defeated. Another possibility is this black hole tethering nearby players with a purple tether before killing them or debuffing them, with the simple solution being to just not stand there. There are also stretch tethers, which you can see are unique by their pulsing arrows. Once you stretch these to a certain distance, they should transform into normal tethers, showing that you have correctly resolved the mechanic. There are also the red-green tethers and the blue tether. You'll normally see these together, or at least you'll see them both used within the same encounter the majority of the time. With red-green tethers, they're also called Christmas tethers often by the player base, people will want to stay close together, and with blue tethers, players will want to stay far apart, otherwise they'll snap. Usually snapping these tethers is actually a success state rather than a failure state, but you need to do it at very specific times and stagger the snaps because they give either a damage or a debuff. This is an Exaflare. It's named after its most recognisable early usage in the final phase of the first ultimate in FF14, the Unending Coil of Bahamut. With these AOEs, they will move in the direction of the arrow, pulsing several attacks one after another in that direction across the room. Usually the best way to dodge these is to stand next to them and then dodge behind them as they pass. Similar to tethers but definitely distinct and worth mentioning are chains. These link you to another player, dealing damage every few seconds. In order to resolve them successfully, you must snap the chain by moving away from one another. As an added nuance, usually these are broken by distance travelled rather than overall distance apart, so it's a good idea to start close to one another and only then spread to make it much easier to snap those chains. Right here are magnets, and I'm going to teach you how they work. With magnet mechanics, usually you will be linked to another player, but once or twice it has been the case where you'll instead be linked with an arena hazard. And each of you will telegraph either a negative or positive polarity. There's a rule for this, the same rule you probably learned when you were 5 years old. Opposites attract, same polarity pushes away. Ideally don't get pushed or pulled into the bad, and otherwise you should be good. These AOEs look a little different than the ones I've shown you already. That's because these black and red AOEs expand. They aren't the only example of expanding hazards in this game, and they don't all look exactly like this, and honestly, they don't all snapshot in the same way either. But these occur every now and then and are a thing to look out for. There are even some AOEs that rather than expanding, will just move around before locking in and executing. Forced March is a debuff mechanic that will cause players to move in a certain direction and to be unable to execute actions of their own choice for the duration of the debuff. The movement direction is relative to where the player was facing, and can sometimes be accompanied by a directional debuff arrow that will send them, say, left or right of where they're facing. This analysis mechanic shows up a few times too at various points. For this one, you will be surrounded by a 270-degree marker, with one quadrant of the barrier remaining open. Honestly, I think this mechanic is kind of telegraphed badly if I'm honest, because it looks like the marker is a barrier of some sort, but it isn't. To solve it, you need to aim the open quadrant of whatever attack is incoming to avoid a failure state. These markers right here are commonly known as limit cut. There are a bunch of different instances of limit cut in the game, and the resolution of each is slightly different. But what you can discern from the iconography alone is that there will be 8 targets and they will be struck in order from 1 through to 8. To make it more visible, even numbers are red and odd numbers are blue. Sometimes these attacks are cleaves, sometimes they're circle AoE jumps on each player, sometimes they're stacks. There's a lot of possibilities, but this information should let you know to not, for example, have 4 and 5 standing on top of each other after 3 resolves, because that's just asking for trouble. We talked about markers on heads before, but these ones are a little special, so I'll mention them individually. These are called Earthshakers. Earthshakers are a conal AoE from the enemy to the marked target, or usually targets. Often with Earthshakers, multiple people are targeted at once, and they will spread away from one another and the leftover members of the group, carefully ensuring there aren't any double hits. These are simply AoEs, but the FF14 community uses some very interesting names for them. This donut is simply, well, be close to the enemy, and this circle means go out, right? Well, in a fairly early raid encounter, these mechanics happened as alternates to one another, and they were called Lunar Dynamo and Iron Chariot. For some reason, the name stuck, so when you hear Dynamo it means in, and Chariot will mean out. Sometimes these are also called Dragon's Voice for in, and Ram's Voice for out too, and you'll recognise these on the game's myriad Chimera enemies. When these red arrows mark a party, after a period of time they will afflict the players with a debuff as a form of failure. This one is simple, just stack up as the mechanic is about to resolve to avoid failing. As long as you're with at least one other player, it will count as a success. This is an acceleration bomb. You can usually easily see them on your buff or debuff bar, with the animation telegraph appearing a little closer to resolution. If you're moving or executing an action when the acceleration bomb cooldown ends, it will explode, causing massive damage and hurling you into the air. To resolve it, keep an eye on the timer or the animation playing above your head. Make sure to stop moving and attacking when it's about to end, and then you can resume normal gameplay after it drops. This blue marker appears quite a lot too. This usually means that the affected person will shortly take a heavy hit that needs to be taken away from other players. It can take the form of a cleave, a large circular AoE jumping on them that applies a debuff, or various other types. You can generally take this as an AoE you do not want to hit other people with. Temporary misdirection is showcased by this little Mickey Mouse hand spinning above your head. When you move whilst under the effect of this, the hand will stop turning, and you can only move in the direction that it's pointing towards. Usually mechanics including this component will have you aim at a particular direction and move towards a safe location. There are also a lot of jail mechanics in FF14. These come in quite a few different shapes and forms, but the most common thread they share is that they bind a target, rendering them unable to use actions or to move, and they must be freed by other members of the party. Often the jail can just be attacked. When its HP is reduced to 0, the trapped player will be released, and other times you need to complete a specific mechanic to help them escape. This is Twister. Twister spawns under players at the end of a cast bar, and if you're standing still to let it spawn underneath your feet, you're gonna go flying. That's bad, so when a Twister mechanic is coming, make sure to keep moving. Enumeration mechanics are usually telegraphed by this circle spinning around a player with a number of orbs inside it. The number of orbs floating inside correlates to the number of players that are needed to be inside the circle upon resolution in order for the mechanic to be completed successfully. These debuffs are called Doom. They usually end up on a player because of a failure state of some variety, but sometimes they are just mechanics that need to be resolved in order to remove them. If a Doom reaches 0, they will kill the target. Some Dooms can be cleansed with Asuna, others can be removed by healing the target to full HP, and some, like I mentioned earlier, need a certain mechanic to be fulfilled to get rid of them. To add to this list of frequently recurring mechanics, here are some terms you may have heard before, but it isn't immediately clear what they actually mean. Final Fantasy XIV players have just adopted them into their dictionaries, and therefore I'm going to do my best to make sure that we aren't just speaking gibberish to you. Consider this of somewhat of a glossary for raid-relevant terminology. Wild Charge refers to any mechanic in which a line stack damage deals additional damage to the first player in the lineup. It's often expected that a tank handles bearing the brunt of a Wild Charge hit. It originates from the attack by Imdugud in turn 10 of the Binding Coil of Bahamut raid by the same name. Protean Wave was originally a mechanic from Alexander III, in which the boss Living Liquid would shoot cleaves at multiple players at once. Now, it's generally used to refer to any mechanic in which players need to spread around the boss hitbox to avoid overlapping attacks. Dynamo and Chariot have been explained before, but I think they are worth mentioning once more. Dynamo means in, and Chariot means out. They originate from turn 9 of Coils via the attacks of its boss Nail. Hot Wing and Hot Tail originate from the Nidhogg trial. Hot Tail refers to one thick line AOE going through the centre of the boss hitbox, rendering the sides safe, and Hot Wing is the opposite, two large AOEs leaving the centre a safe zone. Stillness and Motion originate from the Epic of Alexander Ultima, and it simply means stop moving or keep moving. Nisi or Rot refers to a debuff that will be traded amongst players by touching. Usually these mechanics should only be traded with intent at very specific times. In a lot of cases, they also usually deal chip damage over time to those affected by them. Rot originates from turn 2 of Coil, with Nisi coming in first with turn 4 of the Alexander raid. Twister refers to any mechanic in which you must move at the end of the cast to avoid a placed AoE under your feet. Twister's first appearance is in turn 5 of Coil and is a signature mechanic of Twin Tania. Akmorn refers to a multi-hit, shared tank buster. It first comes from turn 13 of Coil. Shiva refers to AoEs that spawn one by one and explode in the same order they originally spawned in. 3 guesses on where the namesake comes from. Raid buffs refer to damage enhancing abilities from players that share those buffs to other players. This includes skills like Searing Light, Brotherhood, and Technical Finish. Generally, players will want to throw them up in sync with one another to maximize their gains. Raid-wide refers to an instance of damage that hits all players. Personals is usually used to refer to the individual mitigation or self-healing tools that each player possesses. Most jobs in the game have some kind of shield or heal, or even heal over time just for themselves, or a mixture of multiple tools. This refers specifically for tools that affect just yourself. Party Mit or Mitigation refers to those group-wide defensive buffs or debuffs that can be applied to enemies, as well as party-wide shielding that can be provided. We talked about them quite a lot in detail before. Tools like Reprisal, Shake It Off, and Tactician are included here as forms of Party Mit. Drifting is when you do not press your damaging cooldowns as soon as they become available, causing them to slowly delay with each moment of being left ready. Doing this repeatedly can eventually cause these high damage skills to become so delayed that they miss important damage buffs, or if things get really bad, entire usages of the ability in question. Kitchen sink is a term usually used in the context of cooldowns invested to protect against a tank buster. If you kitchen sink a buster, it means you are to press every defensive cooldown you have in soaking it. Burst is usually intrinsically interlinked with your 2-minute cooldowns, but not exclusively. It refers to when you have built up your gauge and your offensive cooldowns are available, and you spend them all for a period of high damage on the foe. Light parties in a raid connotation refers to a split between the 8-player group, in which 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS group together into 2 smaller parties of 4 in order to resolve specific mechanics. These are usually stacks, but there's a lot of variety in the game in terms of the offerings that use light party splits. Clock spots are used to explain an even spread of players around the boss. Each party member will be assigned 1 spread position, and that will be their clock spot for the rest of the fight. Pair mechanics are common in Final Fantasy XIV. This is when 2 players need to stay together or complete a mechanic alongside one another. A common example is 2-player shares with 4 of them going off at once. Usually 1 support player and 1 DPS player will be paired together, but it's not a hard rule, some mechanics work a bit differently. Invulns refer to the immunity skill which each tank possesses, allowing them to soak endless damage safely for a short period of time. Tank invulnerabilities have an extremely long cooldown. Waymarks are an intrinsic part of endgame duties in this game. They are beacons of light that can be placed on the ground outside of combat and will remain in those positions once the enemy has been engaged. Usually they will be placed in a certain configuration for each encounter to provide as many useful reference points as possible for those key mechanics that require precise positioning or those that are considered pain points. To place a waymark, select a waymark from the party menu, choose a waymark and place it. Selecting a waymark's icon a second time will remove it. Quote-unquote clear waymarks will remove all placed waymarks. You can also drag waymarks onto your hotbars for easier access. You can save presets of markers for quick and easy access in encounters where you plan on using them repeatedly. Using and saving marker presets make them great for sharing with other players and proliferating universal static markings. As well as ground-placed waymarks, there is also a fairly robust suite of player markers that are available too, and they can be used to place signifiers above the heads of other members of the party. These are commonly used to mark players for specific mechanics in order to help coordinate and direct them, or to distinguish the tanks and healers from other players more clearly to make it easier to stack around or avoid them in the heat of battle. I generally do not advise you use macros for the most part in combat whilst playing FF14. This is especially true when macroing GCD skills because you can't queue them up. There is a tiny window before your GCD comes up where you can hit the GCD for the next one and have it queue up on the server so that it is executed the moment that it is possibly available. And that's the exact reason why you see so many players mashing their next button rather than trying to time them precisely. Macros with GCDs don't work that way, and thus they will cause small amounts of clipping each time, which will add up quickly. Instead of queuing everything up and having it come out in order, macros make you wait for animations and cooldowns to finish. As we know by now, clipping is bad. I will however give you a few examples of common very useful macros in combat. Firstly, applying a line of text to a certain skill that interacts with a party member, automatically conveying information they may want to know. In this case, as a healer, applying a line of text to your raise in the form of a macro, which states the name of the player you're going to be raising, can be pretty useful for coordination without voice comms. It's somewhat less useful now thanks to the recent quality of life updates to cast bars, which make them show who each person is rezzing, but it doesn't hurt to have this too. On top of this, macros are a very useful tool to allow you to more easily target certain actions at other party members. In my case, I have a macro attached to my Shirk as a tank, which is used to divert my aggro to a selected player. I have the macro auto-select the target as my co-tank because every time I use Shirk, it's almost certainly going to be on that player anyway. It just removes that little extra step of targeting for me. This is why sometimes you'll see these long lists of macros for targeted tank mitigation like the Blackest Night, so they can easily throw them on any player without needing to carefully target first. Now, we're going to discuss optimizing your HUD a little, the basic setup I feel misses some fairly essential and easy changes that can allow you to gain more information easily. First of all, a general gameplay tip I want to give you is that you should be playing zoomed out. This is a third-person MMO, and a lot of the difficulty relies upon looking at your surroundings and then quickly identifying and reacting to hazards if they appear. Having your camera locked in close to your character prevents you from being able to see what's going on, and as such should be avoided. I generally play as far zoomed out as possible, and yes, this does mean that should you have a widescreen monitor, you're playing at an absolutely massive advantage over those that don't have one. I won't give you too much deep advice on how to assign keys to your hotbars, because it's deeply personal and there isn't really a categorically best way to do it, but generally what I like to do is have cohesion between a few things. Firstly, if a button does something on one job, I want it to do that on all of them. For example, my provoke button is at the same place on every tank so that I can't easily mess it up. The 1 of my 1-2-3 combo, in fact all 3 parts of them in general, are in the same spots on every job that use them. I try to keep some kind of rule and normality so that when I change job I can instantly have at least a semblance of muscle memory on the basic skills. Then, I like to group skills together. Combos go together in a neat little group. Commonly used healing actions go together in a group. Defensive cooldowns go together in a nice little party. I always like to make sure that the buttons that I press the most are on the most accessible keybinds as well, and I think that is definitely a move that you should make as well. If you go to character configuration and then to general, you can find the setting for the third person camera angle, which will change how the camera centers on your player character. If you're not comfortable with the default, play around with this and find a setting that works nicely for you. A good HUD in FF14 is all about centralizing important information in one space, without blocking too much screen space at the same time. You want to be able to clearly see mechanics without huge HP bars blocking everything, allotting you the awareness you need, but also to view all your party and status information like HP, buffs, debuffs and enemy casts immediately, and without letting your eyes drift away from the center of the screen. There's a zone right here, and that's the only zone I want you to be looking at for anything other than mechanics. Bear in mind that with this, whatever works for you is the correct thing to do. To achieve this, for me personally, I drag the party list a little bit off the top left side of the screen to center it a little bit more. If I played on a higher resolution, I'd probably center it even more than I do as well. I have my cast bar directly in the center of the screen, right on top of my player character, and above that, directly in my field of view, is my target health bar, focus target information, and enemy list, all in a little box around the center of my screen. Directly down from that, I have my job gauge, hotbars, my buffs and debuffs, neatly split into positive buffs, debuffs, and others. I don't use the minimap too much, or things like that, so I left them default off in the corner of the screen. If I made use of them, I definitely center it a lot more alongside my hotbars, for example. I think that would probably be a good place for it. If you go to system config and then UI resolution settings, you can set your UI resolution to high. This doesn't affect combat as such, but it's a huge quality of life adjustment, and realistically you want to have it on, so just do it. In system config and then mouse settings, you can limit mouse operation to game window and adjust the sensitivity. Honestly, this is up to you, but this is another one I can see you gaining a lot of value from in combat, so I would consider selecting it. This is where you'll want to make a decision between standard movement settings and legacy. If you're on controller, really, legacy is the only choice, so just pick that. But on keyboard and mouse, both have their own advantages and disadvantages. I'm not really going to give you too much advice for this, just try both, one will feel more natural to you, and you should lock in and go with it. Try not to overthink this one. If we tab over to character config and then control settings and target, you can see the option for target type. I like to change this to cone personally. This is useful for people that heavily rely on the tab targeting function in the game. If you change it to conal, the tab targeting will prioritize enemies that are closer to you, making it much easier to quickly lock onto the biggest threats with ease. Type 1 is agnostic of distance and will just purely go from left to right in field of view. Right below that, you'll see the ground targeting settings. I like to limit ring movement to targeting range and press action twice to execute. Both should be enabled in my opinion. This makes placing round abilities like Asylum and Liturgy of the Bell much more responsive, because you can double click to fast place rather than manually having to hit the keybind and then left click it into position. It also means you can't have a wild moment and aim it off into Narnia in an impossible placement position, keeping your placement marker firmly within the realm of possible. Then head over to Character Config, Control Settings and Character, and go over to Battle Effects. This again is personal preference, but honestly I think you're a little bit nuts if your preference is to have every player's effect enabled all the time. It can feel impossible to see everything clearly in Raid, so I do this instead. I keep my own effects on Show All, but for Party and others I change it over to Show Limited. This helps keep visual clutter to a minimum. This is another non-combat related one, but in Character Config to Item Settings, I think it's to your credit to change the Inventory and Retainer interface settings to either Expanded or Open All, whichever you prefer, giving you an instant overview of exactly which items you have at that time, rather than needing to go through a million tabs to find something. In Character Config UI Settings HUD, I think it's important to scroll down to the Targets section and make sure the following options are ticked: Display Enmity List, Display Progress Bar, Display Focus Target Information, and Display Target's Remaining HP Percentage. I actually think most of these are on by default, but the remaining HP percentage one definitely isn't, and I consider it absolutely vital. Then, in Character Config, UI Settings Party List, make sure you tick the box that says Display Remaining Time of Status Effects. This means that you can see the timers of buffs and debuffs for both yourself and allies on the party list, and it's another one that I consider kind of vital. Here, you can also increase the number of buffs and debuffs that display next to a name on the party list. For me personally, I keep it at the default 5, but should you wish, you can push it all the way up to 10. Whatever works for you is totally fine here. On Character Config to Hotbar settings, another quality of life adjustment I like to make on display is firstly enabling the option to display recast timers, and secondly to change them to Type 2 Centered for a little more visibility. One last thing I like to do is go into the HUD settings for the job gauge and change it to simple mode. I just think it's a much cleaner way to convey the same information, and it takes up a lot less space. One last change which I think is exceptionally useful, especially for new players, is to create a hotbar without any keybinds attached to it. I've been using this for years now, and honestly I'm at the point where I don't really need it too much anymore, but I absolutely relied on it in the past, and I think you can gain good value from it too. What you do with this is you put important cooldowns that you don't want to forget here. This is to act as a reminder and a constantly visible reference point for if these actions are available, and if not, when they will be. If you always forget that one button, make it super big, stick it on a non-binded and visible hotbar, and then there's no way you can miss it ever again. In my opinion, very, very helpful. So this was a bit of a long one, huh? I know there will 100% be at least one or two things I missed, so if I forgot one of the basics, please let me know in the comments section, and if there's enough entries, I will put together an addendum to this video in order to properly incorporate them. I hope at least some of this was useful to you as a new player, and even if you're more experienced that you were able to garner something from this. Remember, I have role guides for healer, tank and DPS coming out soon that will go further into the specifics and detail of how you play each of those roles effectively, so be on the lookout for that. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know, and as always, have a fantastic rest of your day.